In quiet villages and cozy parlors where teacups clink and roses bloom, Miss Marple watches and notices everything. Behind every smile, she sees the secrets, and where others see gossip, she finds the truth. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Hurry. Isn't it lovely how these stories bring us together, no matter the distance? Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And have you ever guessed the culprit before Miss Marple? Let's begin. Chapter 1. A Delicate Discovery. The morning light filtered through the windows of St. Mary Mead's Parish Hall, illuminating countless boxes and piles of items donated for the annual church bazaar. Miss Jane Marple, her snow-white hair neatly arranged beneath a small hat, was methodically sorting through a particularly promising box of linens. Her thin, delicate fingers moved with surprising dexterity for a woman of her age, carefully separating the usable from the worn beyond repair. "Oh, this is a particularly good batch," she remarked to Mrs. Bantry, who was working alongside her. "People have been most generous this year." Mrs. Bantry, the former mistress of Gossington Hall and one of Miss Marple's oldest friends, nodded in agreement. "Indeed they have, though I suspect most are simply clearing out their attics now that spring cleaning is upon us." "Very likely," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. "One person's unwanted items become another's treasures." Her fingers suddenly paused over something nestled between two faded tablecloths. Carefully, she withdrew a handkerchief of such exquisite craftsmanship that it seemed entirely out of place among the modest donations. The delicate lace work around its edges spoke of skilled hands and considerable expense. "My goodness," Miss Marple breathed, holding it up to the light. "This is quite remarkable." Mrs. Bantry abandoned her own sorting to peer over her friend's shoulder. "Oh, what a beautiful piece. That's Belgian lace, if I'm not mistaken. Late Victorian, I should think. The Lethbridge family had pieces similar to this. I remember seeing them when Lady Lethbridge was still alive." Miss Marple nodded, turning the handkerchief over carefully in her hands. The initials E.L. were embroidered in one corner with painstaking precision, each letter flowing into the next with elegant flourishes. "E.L.," she murmured, her faded blue eyes narrowing slightly as she examined the delicate fabric more closely. There, in one corner, almost invisible unless one was looking for it, was a faint brownish stain. Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. She had seen enough in her long life to recognize the distinctive discoloration that blood left behind, even after many years. "I wonder how such a valuable piece came to be in our donation box," she said, careful to keep her tone merely curious rather than concerned. At that moment, the vicar entered, carrying yet another box of donated items. His round face was flushed with the exertion. "Ah, ladies, how are we progressing? Quite the mountain to get through before Saturday, isn't there?" "Indeed, Vicar," Miss Marple agreed. "I was just admiring this handkerchief. It seems quite valuable. Do you happen to know which box it came from?" The vicar set down his burden and wiped his brow. "Let me see. Oh yes, that one would have come from the Thornfield House lot. Quite generous of the new owner, Mr. Carmichael, to donate so much. The house had been standing empty for nearly 20 years, you know, until he purchased it last autumn. London businessman, I believe. Been renovating ever since." "Thornfield House," Mrs. Bantry mused. "That was the Lethbridge family home, wasn't it? Until the last of them moved away. Only old Colonel Lethbridge left now, and he lives in that flat over by the station." Miss Marple nodded, carefully folding the handkerchief and placing it aside. "Perhaps we should set this with the more valuable items for the curiosity store," she suggested. "It might fetch a good price for the church roof fund." They continued their work through the afternoon, sorting through generations of household linens, ornaments, and books. It was among these latter items that Miss Marple made her second discovery of the day. An old, leather-bound prayer book, its spine cracked and pages yellowed with age, contained something tucked between its leaves. "How curious," she murmured, gently extracting what proved to be a photograph. It was faded and slightly sepia-toned, as photographs from the previous century often were. It showed a young woman in Victorian dress, her high-necked gown and upswept hair typical of the fashion of the 1880s. In her hand, clearly visible, was what appeared to be the very same handkerchief Miss Marple had found earlier. Turning the photograph over, she saw writing in faded ink. Elizabeth, 1887. E.L., she whispered to herself. Elizabeth Lethbridge, perhaps. Neither Mrs. Bantry nor the vicar noticed Miss Marple slipping both the photograph and the prayer book into her basket to examine more thoroughly at home. Something about the conjunction of that valuable handkerchief, the photograph, and the faint stain troubled her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Evening had fallen by the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage. Her garden, always meticulously tended, seemed particularly peaceful in the gathering twilight. Inside, she lit the lamps and settled herself in her favorite armchair, the prayer book and photograph on the small table beside her. She was just examining the handkerchief under her magnifying glass, studying the suspicious stain more closely, when a sharp knock at the door startled her. It was unusual for her to receive visitors at this hour. Opening the door revealed the broad, impatient figure of Inspector Slack from the local police. His expression, never particularly warm, seemed especially grim tonight. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, with the bare minimum of politeness. "Sorry to disturb you at this hour, but I thought you might want to know, seeing as how you're involved with sorting those donations from Thornfield House." "Yes, Inspector?" Miss Marple inquired, a slight tremor in her voice betraying her anticipation of unpleasant news. "There's been a discovery at Thornfield House," he said bluntly. "Workers removing a section of wall in the cellar for Mr. Carmichael's renovations found something they weren't expecting." "Oh dear," Miss Marple murmured, though she had already guessed what was coming. "Human remains," Inspector Slack confirmed, his eyes sharp on her face. "Walled up in the cellar. Been there a long time by the looks of things. Thought you should know, since you church ladies might hear things when you're sawing through all that stuff from the house." "How very shocking," Miss Marple said softly, her mind already racing to connect this grim discovery with the blood-stained handkerchief and the photograph of Elizabeth. "Thank you for telling me, Inspector. I shall certainly keep my ears open for anything that might assist your investigation." After the inspector had gone, Miss Marple returned to her armchair and picked up the handkerchief once more. The brownish stains seemed darker now in the lamplight, a silent witness to some long-ago tragedy. "Elizabeth," she whispered to the empty room, "what happened to you at Thornfield House all those years ago? And why has your secret finally come to light now?" Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, pattering against the windows like the tapping of impatient fingers. Miss Marple knew she wouldn't sleep easily tonight, not with the image of that young woman from the photograph in her mind, and the knowledge that somewhere in Thornfield House, death had remained hidden behind a wall for decades, waiting to be discovered. Chapter 2. Whispers at the Church Bazaar. The day of St. Mary Mead's church bazaar dawned clear and bright, belying the dark discovery that had set the village abuzz with speculation. Miss Marple had risen earlier than usual, her night's sleep disturbed by thoughts of the handkerchief, the photograph, and the remains found walled up in Thornfield House's cellar. She had spent the morning carefully arranging her homemade jams and preserves in attractive displays for her stall, each jar meticulously labelled in her neat handwriting. By noon, the church grounds were filled with villagers and visitors from neighbouring parishes, all drawn as much by the promise of gossip as by the goods for sale. Miss Marple's position behind her stall afforded her an excellent vantage point from which to observe and, more importantly, to overhear. "They're saying the bones might be over 70 years old," Mrs. Price Ridley informed her companion in what she clearly believed to be a discreet tone as they browsed Miss Marple's raspberry preserves. "Victorian times, when Thornfield belonged to the Lethbridges." "The Lethbridges?" her friend replied. "Wasn't there some scandal about them years ago? My grandmother used to hint at something, though she would never say what precisely." Miss Marple smiled benignly as she wrapped their purchases in paper. "The raspberries were particularly fine last summer," she remarked, giving no indication that she had heard or was interested in their conversation. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple took notice of the various stalls. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had arranged a table of curiosities, the more unusual donations that didn't fit neatly into other categories. Among these, prominently displayed, was the lace handkerchief Miss Marple had discovered. She had returned it to the donation box before leaving the parish hall yesterday, deciding that keeping it would be improper. Now she watched as various people examined it, wondering if anyone else would recognize its significance. Marvelous piece of Belgian lace, she overheard Mrs. Clement explaining to a visitor. Late Victorian, see the initials here. E.L. We believe it may have belonged to the Lethbridge family who used to own Thornfield House. A sudden stir near the entrance to the churchyard caught Miss Marple's attention. Colonel Lethbridge had arrived, a tall, distinguished figure despite his advanced years. His back was ramrod straight, a remnant of his military bearing, though his face was deeply lined and his sparse hair completely white. The colonel rarely appeared at village functions, preferring his solitude, which made his attendance today all the more remarkable. Miss Marple observed him carefully as he made his way through the crowd, nodding curtly to acquaintances, but stopping to speak with no one. His path took him inevitably toward Mrs. Clement's curiosity stall, and Miss Marple found herself holding her breath as he approached the display where the handkerchief lay. The colonel's reaction was subtle but unmistakable to Miss Marple's observant eyes. He stopped abruptly, the color draining from his weathered face. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, staring at the handkerchief as though he had seen a ghost. Then, with visible effort, he composed himself and addressed Mrs. Clement. "I say," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the now quieter bazaar, "that handkerchief, it belonged to my family, to my Aunt Elizabeth, in fact. I'd be happy to purchase it for, shall we say, £20. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. £20 was an excessive sum for a handkerchief, even one of such quality, and everyone knew the colonel lived modestly on his pension. Mrs. Clement looked flustered. "Oh, well, that's very generous, Colonel, but I'm afraid I've already promised it to Professor Wilkins. He collects antique textiles, you see, and expressed interest earlier." The colonel's face hardened. £30 then, he said tersely. "Surely the church would benefit more from my offer." An uncomfortable silence fell. Mrs. Clement glanced toward the vicar, who had approached at the sound of the raised voices. "Now, Colonel," the vicar said placatingly, "I'm sure we can work something out. Perhaps if you explained your particular attachment to the piece—" "It is a family heirloom," the colonel interrupted stiffly. "That should be sufficient explanation." Miss Marple's attention was momentarily diverted by the arrival of a sleek automobile. From it emerged a well-dressed couple, Mr. Richard Carmichael, the new owner of Thornfield House, and his wife Veronica. Mr. Carmichael was a robust man in his 50s, with the confident air of one accustomed to success in business. His wife, at least 20 years his junior, was strikingly beautiful, with dark hair and eyes that spoke of Mediterranean ancestry. The Carmichaels' arrival created enough of a distraction that Miss Marple could observe without being noticed as Veronica Carmichael's gaze settled on Colonel Lethbridge. There was something in that look, an intensity, a focus, that struck Miss Marple as significant. It was not mere curiosity about the local personality. It was something deeper, more purposeful. The colonel, however, had turned away from Mrs. Clement's stall in evident frustration, and did not immediately notice the newcomers. His path through the crowd brought him face to face with an elderly woman who had been standing quietly at the edge of the gathering. Miss Marple recognized her as Mrs. Ellison, who lived in one of the council cottages and was rarely seen at village events. The colonel stopped short, a look of recognition and dismay crossing his features. Mrs. Ellison, for her part, met his gaze steadily, her rheumy eyes holding his for a long moment, before she inclined her head in the barest acknowledgement and turned away. Miss Marple made a mental note of the exchange. Mrs. Ellison, she recalled, had once been in service at Thornfield House many years ago. The woman must be in her 80s now, which would mean she had worked for the Lethbridge family during the period when Elizabeth Lethbridge was alive. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple sold the last of her jams and began to pack away her store. She had just finished when she noticed Mrs. Clement approaching, looking distressed. "Miss Marple," she said in a low voice, "the most extraordinary thing has happened. The lace handkerchief has disappeared. I only stepped away for a moment to fetch change for a customer, and when I returned, it was gone." "How very strange," Miss Marple replied, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. "Was anyone near your store when you left it?" "Several people," Mrs. Clement admitted, "though I didn't notice anyone particularly close to the handkerchief." "Oh dear, what will Professor Wilkins say? And the Colonel? He'll think I took his money after all and simply pocketed the handkerchief." "I'm sure he won't think any such thing," Miss Marple assured her. "But it is curious. I wonder." She glanced around the churchyard, noting that Colonel Lethbridge had already departed. The Carmichaels were still present, chatting with the vicar by the gate. Mrs. Ellison, too, had gone. "I believe I might pay a visit to Mrs. Ellison tomorrow," Miss Marple said decisively. "She makes the most wonderful tea cakes, and I've been meaning to call on her for some time." Mrs. Clement looked surprised. "Mrs. Ellison? But she rarely receives visitors. She's become quite reclusive in recent years." "Oh, I think she might make an exception for me," Miss Marple smiled gently. "We have a mutual interest in embroidery, you know." That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her window overlooking the garden, she carefully arranged her thoughts about the day's events. The Colonel's extreme reaction to the handkerchief, his tense exchange with Mrs. Ellison, the Carmichael woman's interest in the Colonel, and now the disappearance of the handkerchief itself. All these formed a pattern that suggested something more than coincidence. She took out the photograph she had found in the prayer book, studying again the young woman holding what appeared to be the same handkerchief. Elizabeth Lethbridge, 1887. If the remains in the cellar of Thornfield House dated from that era, could they possibly be those of the Colonel's aunt? A sharp knock at her door interrupted her musings. It was Inspector Slack again, his expression even grimmer than the previous evening. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble when she opened the door, "that handkerchief you found yesterday, I understand it's gone missing from the church bazaar." "Yes, Inspector," she replied calmly. "Mrs. Clement informed me of its disappearance late this afternoon." "Did she now?" His eyes narrowed. "And I suppose you've no idea who might have taken it?" "I wouldn't like to speculate without evidence," Miss Marple said primly. "Though I did observe that Colonel Lethbridge seemed most eager to acquire it. He offered quite a substantial sum." "Did he, indeed?" Inspector Slack's expression darkened further. "Well, that's interesting, because the preliminary examination of those remains suggests they belonged to a young woman who died approximately 70 years ago. And according to the records, the last occupants of Thornfield House at that time were the Lethbridge family." "How very troubling," Miss Marple murmured. "And you believe the handkerchief might be connected to these remains?" "I believe," the inspector said slowly, "that someone in this village knows more than they're letting on about what happened at Thornfield House all those years ago. And I mean to find out what it is." After the inspector had gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. The night had grown dark, but her mind was illuminated by the connections beginning to form between the disparate pieces of information. Tomorrow she would visit Mrs. Ellison, and perhaps begin to unravel the mystery that had lain hidden behind the walls of Thornfield House for 3/4 of a century. Chapter 3: The Colonel's Hidden Past. The following morning dawned with a fine mist hovering over St. Mary Mead, shrouding the village in a gauzy veil that seemed appropriate to Miss Marple as she prepared for her visit to Mrs. Ellison. Some instinct prompted her to wear her best grey dress and to take particular care with her appearance. Mrs. Ellison might be elderly and reclusive, but she had once been in service to the gentry, and such people often retained their respect for proper appearances. Miss Marple set out just after 11, carrying a small jar of her finest strawberry preserves as a gift. Mrs. Ellison's cottage stood at the far end of the village, a modest dwelling with a surprisingly well-tended garden. The roses, in particular, were magnificent, climbing over the front of the cottage in a cascade of pink and white blooms. Her knock was answered promptly by Mrs. Ellison herself, a thin, upright woman whose sharp eyes belied her advanced years. "Miss Marple," she acknowledged with a touch of wariness, "I've been expecting you." "Have you indeed?" Miss Marple replied mildly, not betraying her surprise. "How kind of you to receive me. I've brought a little something from my garden." She offered a jar of preserves. Mrs. Ellison accepted the gift with a nod that was almost a curtsy, a vestige, Miss Marple thought, of her years in service. "You'd better come in," she said, stepping aside. The interior of the cottage was meticulously clean, every surface gleaming. It was filled with the sort of small mementos that accumulate over a long life: photographs in silver frames, delicate china figurines, embroidered cushions. Miss Marple noted that despite Mrs. Ellison's modest circumstances, many of these items were of surprisingly good quality. "Tea," Mrs. Ellison offered, already moving toward the kitchen. "That would be lovely, thank you." While her hostess prepared the tea, Miss Marple took the opportunity to examine the photographs more closely. Most were typical family portraits, children and grandchildren at various ages, but one caught her attention. It showed a much younger Mrs. Ellison in a housemaid's uniform, standing at attention beside a grand staircase that Miss Marple recognized from her one long-ago visit to Thornfield House. Mrs. Ellison returned with a tea tray, catching Miss Marple's gaze on the photograph. "That was taken in 1908, she said, setting down the tray. "I was 22 and had just been promoted to head housemaid." "It looks like a fine household," Miss Marple commented, taking the seat Mrs. Ellison indicated. "Thornfield House has always been the grandest in the village." Mrs. Ellison's lips thinned as she poured the tea. "Grand, yes, but not always happy." Miss Marple accepted her cup with a murmur of thanks. "I understand you were there during the time of the Lethbridge family, before the house stood empty." A silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the carriage clock on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Ellison seemed to be debating with herself, her gnarled fingers restless on the tablecloth. "I was," she said finally, "from 1904 until the family left in 1912. Nearly 8 years." "That would have been during Colonel Lethbridge's youth," Miss Marple suggested. "He must have been, what? In his 20s then?" "The Colonel was the younger son," Mrs. Ellison replied, her voice taking on a distant quality as she recalled the past. "Always in his brother's shadow until the war took Mr. Charles. The old master, their father, was still alive then, though he died not long after the family left Thornfield." Miss Marple sipped her tea, allowing silence to draw out Mrs. Ellison's memories. "There was a scandal, wasn't there?" she prompted gently when the older woman remained quiet. "Something to do with the Colonel's aunt, Elizabeth Lethbridge." Mrs. Ellison's head snapped up, her eyes suddenly sharp. "Who told you that?" "No one, directly," Miss Marple assured her. "But at my age, one remembers bits and pieces over the years. And there was a photograph I came across recently. A young woman from the 1880s, with the initials EL. I couldn't help wondering if it might be Elizabeth Lethbridge." Mrs. Ellison set down her teacup with a faint clink. "It's not something people talk about," she said stiffly. "The family made sure of that." "I understand," Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "But perhaps it's time the truth was known, especially with what's been discovered at Thornfield House." The color drained from Mrs. Ellison's face. "You know about that? The remains?" "Inspector Slack informed me," Miss Marple confirmed. "They believe they date from the Victorian era. From Elizabeth's time, perhaps." Mrs. Ellison's hands trembled visibly now. She rose abruptly and went to a small desk in the corner, unlocking a drawer with a key she wore around her neck. From it, she withdrew a small, leather-bound book. "I kept a diary," she said, returning to her seat. "Not during Elizabeth's time. I wasn't born until 1886, but later, when I worked in the house, I heard things. The older servants talked when they thought no one was listening." She opened the diary to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Elizabeth Lethbridge was the sister of the old master, Colonel Lethbridge's grandfather, not his father, as it's commonly believed. She was a great beauty in her day, they said, and engaged to marry a wealthy industrialist from Manchester. But something went wrong, Miss Marple guessed. Mrs. Ellison nodded. She fell in love with an Italian music teacher who came to give her piano lessons. Signor Varelli, his name was. Giuseppe Varelli. When the family discovered the attachment, the music teacher disappeared overnight. It was said he returned to Italy, but some of the servants had their doubts. And Elizabeth, Miss Marple prompted. Officially, she died of a fever shortly afterward, Mrs. Ellison replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper. But Martha, she was the head housemaid then, and still working at Thornfield when I arrived. She told me that Elizabeth had been in perfect health until the night her brother found her trying to leave with a packed valise. There was a terrible row, she said, and the next morning Elizabeth was ill. No doctor was called until she was already dead. Miss Marple's eyes widened. They let her die? Martha didn't say that exactly, Mrs. Ellison qualified, but she did mention hearing strange noises from the cellar at night during the days before Elizabeth's illness was announced, and afterward the cellar was kept locked, with only the master having the key. She turned several pages in the diary, then continued. Here, I wrote down what Martha told me about Elizabeth's last days. She was in great distress, weeping constantly and refusing food. Martha feared she might harm herself and tried to keep watch, but one night she was sent on an errand to the village by the master himself. When she returned, Elizabeth was already confined to her bed with the supposed fever. Miss Marple absorbed this information in silence, her nimble mind connecting it to what she already knew. The handkerchief, she said suddenly. The one with the initials E.L. and the blood stain. It was Elizabeth's, wasn't it? Mrs. Ellison looked startled. Blood stain? I don't know about that, but yes, Elizabeth was known for her fine handkerchiefs. She did beautiful embroidery. The handkerchief was recently found among donations from Thornfield House, Miss Marple explained. It caused quite a reaction from Colonel Lethbridge at the church bazaar. Did it now? Mrs. Ellison's expression hardened. Well, he would be concerned, wouldn't he? Family secrets coming to light after all these years. Mrs. Ellison, Miss Marple said carefully, do you believe that Elizabeth Lethbridge was murdered by her family? The old woman's hands clutched the diary tightly. I believe, she said slowly, that Elizabeth Lethbridge never had the fever they claimed killed her, and I believe that someone in that house knew what really happened to her. But Martha died years ago, and now there's only the Colonel left who might know the truth. As Miss Marple rose to leave some time later, she paused at the door. There's one more thing, Mrs. Ellison. At the bazaar I noticed you and Colonel Lethbridge seemed to recognize each other, though no words were exchanged. May I ask what connection you have to him, beyond having worked in his family's home? For a moment, Mrs. Ellison seemed on the verge of refusing to answer. Then she sighed, suddenly looking every one of her 80-odd years. My mother, she said quietly, came to work at Thornfield as a scullery maid in 1886. She was barely 16. She left suddenly in early 1888, supposedly to care for a sick relative. When she returned to the village months later, she had me with her and a story about a hasty marriage to a soldier who died before they could formalize things. The Lethbridges gave her a cottage on their estate, and later found positions for both of us at Thornfield when I was old enough to work. The Colonel knows who my mother really was, and who my father was too, I suspect, though neither of them ever told me outright. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly at this revelation. I see, she said softly. Thank you for trusting me with this, Mrs. Ellison. Walking home through the village, Miss Marple was so absorbed in her thoughts that she almost missed a sleek automobile parked discreetly down a lane as she passed. A movement caught her eye, and she turned to see Colonel Lethbridge sitting in the driver's seat, watching Mrs. Ellison's cottage intently. Their eyes met briefly before the Colonel started his engine and drove away. Miss Marple continued her walk, her mind racing with new questions. Why was the Colonel watching Mrs. Ellison? Was he afraid of what she might reveal? And what did he know about the remains found in the cellar of his family's former home? That evening, as Miss Marple sat knitting by her fireside, her telephone rang. It was Dr. Haydock, the village physician and occasional consultant to the police. Miss Marple, he said without preamble, I thought you should know. The preliminary examination of those remains from Thornfield House confirms they belong to a young woman, approximately 20 to 25 years old, who died roughly 70 years ago. I see, Miss Marple replied, her needles pausing mid-stitch. Was there any indication of the cause of death, Doctor? That's just it, Doctor. Haydock's voice lowered confidentially. There's evidence of a blow to the skull, significant enough to be fatal. This wasn't a natural death, Miss Marple. It was homicide. After hanging up, Miss Marple sat motionless for several minutes, staring into the flames of her fire. Then her telephone rang again. This time, it was Inspector Slack. The handkerchief's been reported stolen, he informed her brusquely. Mrs. Clement has made an official complaint. Given the connection to Thornfield House and those remains, I'm treating this seriously. Have you recalled anything else that might be relevant? Not at present, Inspector, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, though I did have a most informative tea with Mrs. Ellison today. Did you indeed? Slack's tone sharpened with interest. I may need to speak with her myself. Good night, Miss Marple. As she prepared for bed that night, Miss Marple found herself thinking of Elizabeth Lethbridge, dead before her time, her remains hidden away for decades, and of a blood-stained handkerchief that had surfaced after all these years, only to vanish again, as if the past were determined to keep its secrets. Chapter 4, Midnight in the Library. The invitation to dinner at Gossington Hall arrived the following morning, delivered by Mrs. Bantry's gardener. Miss Marple read it with interest, noting that Colonel Lethbridge and the Carmichaels were also to be guests. Mrs. Bantry had always possessed a talent for gathering together the most intriguing combination of people, and Miss Marple suspected this evening would prove particularly illuminating. She dressed with care that evening, selecting a black lace dress that, while dating from before the war, still maintained an air of quiet elegance. Around her neck, she fastened a string of pearls, her one good piece of jewelry, inherited from her mother. Gossington Hall was ablaze with lights as Miss Marple arrived, driven by the vicar who had been heading in that direction to visit a parishioner. The imposing Georgian facade of the house was reflected in the still waters of the ornamental pond, creating a perfect mirror image that was broken only by the occasional ripple when a fish rose to the surface. "Jane, darling," Mrs. Bantry greeted her at the door, resplendent in a midnight blue gown that Miss Marple privately thought a trifle too youthful for her friend's age. "I'm so glad you could come. Arthur is in London again. Some dreary military dinner, so I'm in desperate need of congenial company." "How kind of you to include me, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, allowing her friend to lead her into the drawing room where the other guests were already assembled. Colonel Lethbridge stood by the fireplace, a glass of sherry in his hand, looking every inch the retired military officer in his well-worn dinner jacket. He inclined his head stiffly in greeting as Miss Marple entered. The Carmichaels were seated together on a small sofa, Mrs. Carmichael's vivid beauty emphasized by her crimson dress, which stood out dramatically against her husband's conventional black and white evening attire. Mr. Carmichael rose politely as Miss Marple was introduced, his handshake firm and his smile genial, though his eyes remained watchful. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've heard so much about you from the vicar. He tells me you have quite a reputation for solving mysteries." "Oh dear," Miss Marple replied with a self-deprecating laugh. "I'm afraid the vicar exaggerates. I merely observe, and sometimes notice parallels with situations I've encountered before." "Even so," Mrs. Carmichael interjected, her voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent, "such observations must be invaluable in a case like this awful business at Thornfield. Richard and I were shocked when the workers made that dreadful discovery." "Yes, most distressing," Miss Marple agreed, accepting a glass of sherry from Mrs. Bantry. "Though I understand such things were not uncommon in older houses, people were buried in all sorts of places in earlier times. But not usually inside walls, Mr. Carmichael pointed out, a hint of grimness in his tone. That suggests concealment rather than traditional burial. Indeed, Colonel Lethbridge said shortly, moving to refill his glass. Though speculation is pointless until the police complete their investigation. A strained silence fell, broken by Mrs. Bantry announcing that dinner was served. As they moved into the dining room, Miss Marple noted the seating arrangement with interest. She had been placed between Mr. Carmichael and the Colonel, with Mrs. Carmichael directly across from her, beside Mrs. Bantry. Conversation during the soup course remained determinedly neutral, focusing on the recent weather and the success of the church bazaar. It was not until the fish was served that Mrs. Bantry, never one for prolonged social niceties, broached the subject that was clearly on everyone's mind. I understand you've been finding all sorts of interesting things during your renovations at Thornfield, Mr. Carmichael, she said. Apart from the unfortunate discovery in the cellar. Mr. Carmichael dabbed at his lips with his napkin before replying. Yes, indeed. The house is a veritable treasure trove of history. Just last week, I discovered a hidden compartment in the library containing old letters and documents from the Lethbridge family. Colonel Lethbridge's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Documents? What sort of documents? Correspondence mainly, Mr. Carmichael replied, seeming not to notice the sudden tension in the Colonel's posture. Dating from the late Victorian era. Fascinating reading, I must say. I've been studying them with great interest. Those papers rightfully belong to the Lethbridge family, the Colonel said sharply. As the last living member, I must insist they be returned to me. An uncomfortable silence descended on the table. Miss Marple observed the quick glance exchanged between the Carmichaels, a look that contained a wealth of unspoken communication. Of course, if there are personal family papers, they should be returned to you, Colonel, Mrs. Carmichael said smoothly. Richard meant no offense by examining them. We're simply interested in the history of our new home. The Colonel subsided, but Miss Marple could see that he remained tense, his fingers gripping his knife and fork more tightly than necessary. Have you found mention of Elizabeth Lethbridge in these papers, Mr. Carmichael? Miss Marple inquired innocently, ignoring the startled look Mrs. Bantry shot her. Elizabeth? Mr. Carmichael frowned slightly. The name doesn't ring a bell, though I haven't gone through all the correspondence yet. Elizabeth was the Colonel's aunt, I believe, Miss Marple continued mildly. She died quite young, if I remember correctly. She was my grandfather's sister, the Colonel corrected stiffly. And yes, she died of a fever in 1887. A tragedy, but hardly unusual for the time. Miss Marple noted the slight emphasis he placed on the cause of death, as if anticipating contradiction. She also observed that Mrs. Carmichael was watching the Colonel with that same intense focus she had displayed at the church bazaar. Such a pity, Miss Marple murmured. By all accounts, she was a great beauty. There was a photograph of her among the donations for the bazaar, holding a particularly lovely lace handkerchief with her initials. The handkerchief that went missing, Mrs. Bantry supplied helpfully. Such a strange coincidence. There is no coincidence, the Colonel said sharply. That handkerchief was taken by someone who recognized its significance to my family. And what significance might that be, Colonel? Mrs. Carmichael asked, her dark eyes fixed on his face. Before he could answer, they were interrupted by the arrival of the main course, and the conversation necessarily paused as the servants served the roast beef and vegetables. When they had withdrawn, Mrs. Bantry deftly steered the discussion to safer topics, and the tension gradually eased. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere had lightened considerably, aided by the excellent wine Mr. Carmichael had brought as a gift for their hostess. Even the Colonel seemed more relaxed, though Miss Marple noticed he kept a careful eye on Mrs. Carmichael whenever she spoke. After dinner, Mrs. Bantry suggested the gentlemen might like to smoke in the library, while the ladies had their coffee in the drawing room. This traditional separation of the sexes was, Miss Marple knew, a deliberate strategy on her friend's part. Mrs. Bantry had no real interest in such old-fashioned customs, but she did have a keen interest in arranging private conversations when it suited her. Sure enough, once they were settled in the drawing room, Mrs. Bantry made a show of suddenly remembering an important letter she needed to write. "I must attend to it before I forget again," she declared. "Veronica, would you be a dear and help me locate a book of stamps in my study? I'm sure they're in there somewhere." After they had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly sipping her coffee, counting mentally. As she reached 60, the door to the library opened and Mrs. Bantry appeared. "Oh, Jane," she said, with transparent casualness, "would you mind fetching my reading glasses from the library? I believe I left them on the desk." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Dolly's manipulations were as obvious as they were well-intentioned. "Of course, dear," she replied, rising. The library at Gossington Hall was a comfortable room, lined with bookshelves and furnished with deep leather armchairs. The French windows at one end opened onto the terrace and garden beyond, currently visible only as a darker mass against the night sky. One of these windows was slightly ajar, allowing in a gentle breeze that stirred the papers on the desk. As Miss Marple entered, she found Colonel Lethbridge alone, standing by these windows, staring out into the darkness. Mr. Carmichael was nowhere to be seen. "I beg your pardon, Colonel," she said. "I've just come to fetch Dolly's reading glasses." The Colonel turned, and in the lamplight, Miss Marple was struck by the weariness in his face. He looked older than his years, burdened by something that went beyond the normal weight of age. "Miss Marple," he acknowledged, making no move to leave. "I suppose Dolly arranged this little tête-à-tête. She always did have a gift for manipulation." "She means well," Miss Marple replied, making no attempt to deny the obvious. "And perhaps she thought you might wish to speak privately about certain matters." The Colonel was silent for a long moment, then gestured to a chair. "You may as well sit down. I imagine you have questions." Miss Marple took the offered seat, arranging her skirts with care. "I was curious about your reaction to the handkerchief," she began. "It seemed to disturb you greatly." "It belonged to my Aunt Elizabeth," he said shortly. "A family heirloom that should never have been among those donations." "The handkerchief with the blood stain," Miss Marple said quietly. The Colonel's head snapped up. "You noticed that?" "I'm observant," she replied simply. "And I wonder, what connection might there be between that blood-stained handkerchief and the remains found in the cellar of your family home?" A muscle twitched in the Colonel's jaw. "You've been talking to Mrs. Ellison, I understand." "Yes," Miss Marple admitted. "She shared some interesting recollections about your family and about Elizabeth in particular." "Mrs. Ellison," the Colonel said with deliberate control, "is an elderly woman whose memory is not always reliable." "Perhaps," Miss Marple conceded, "yet certain facts seem beyond dispute. Elizabeth was engaged to one man but fell in love with another, an Italian music teacher. Shortly after this attachment was discovered, the music teacher disappeared, and Elizabeth allegedly died of a fever." The Colonel turned back to the window, his profile rigid against the darkness beyond. "My family history is not a matter for village gossip, Miss Marple." "Murder is hardly gossip, Colonel," she replied quietly. "And I believe that's what we're discussing here, isn't it? The murder of your Aunt Elizabeth." Before he could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of a tremendous crash from somewhere outside. The Colonel whirled around, moving swiftly to the French windows and throwing them wide open. "That came from Thornfield," he said urgently. "Something's happened." Miss Marple joined him on the terrace, peering into the darkness. In the distance, beyond the gardens and across the fields that separated Gossington Hall from Thornfield House, lights were moving erratically, as if someone were running with a torch. "We must go at once," the Colonel declared, already striding toward the house. "Something's wrong." Events moved quickly after that. Mr. Carmichael, it transpired, had slipped away from the dinner party early, claiming a headache, and returned to Thornfield. The crash they had heard was the result of someone breaking into the house through a library window. Mr. Carmichael, investigating the noise, had surprised the intruder and been struck on the head for his trouble. By the time Miss Marple arrived at Thornfield, driven there in the Colonel's car, along with Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Carmichael, the police had already been summoned. Inspector triumphantly, marriage records from the neighboring parish of St. Clement's, Richard Carmichael to Veronica Maria Varelli 2 years ago. Her parents are listed as James and Elena Varelli of London. And her grandparents? Miss Marple inquired. Mr. Benson peered at the document. Nothing listed here, but... He rummaged further. Ah, this might help. It's a copy of an old Italian birth certificate, submitted as part of some property transaction a few years back. Elena Varelli, born 1930, daughter of Marco Varelli and Sofia Bianchi. And here, he pointed to a notation at the bottom. Marco is identified as the son of Giuseppe Varelli, born 1862 in Naples, died 1901 in Milan. Thank you, Miss Marple said, making a mental note of the dates. That's most helpful. As twilight settled over the village, Miss Marple walked slowly home, piecing together the story that was gradually emerging. Giuseppe Varelli, born 1862, would have been 25 when he came to England as a music teacher and fell in love with Elizabeth Lethbridge. He returned to Italy after her death, perhaps never knowing she was carrying his child, and died young in 1901. But if Mrs. Ellison's hints were correct and her mother had been that child, her thoughts were interrupted by a soft thud on her cottage doorstep as she approached. Looking down, she saw a small package wrapped in brown paper. Glancing quickly around, she saw no one in the gathering darkness. Inside her cottage, with the door firmly locked, she unwrapped the package. Inside was the missing lace handkerchief, its delicate fabric still bearing the faint bloodstain in one corner. Wrapped around it was a note in an elegant, elderly hand. Justice at last. Miss Marple stared at the handkerchief for a long moment, then reached for her telephone. Inspector Slack needed to know about this development, and about her suspicions regarding Veronica Carmichael's true connection to Elizabeth Lethbridge and the village of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 6. Unraveling the Final Thread. Miss Marple's cottage had never hosted such a diverse gathering. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, highlighting the tension on the faces of her assembled guests. She had arranged the chairs in a semicircle around her fireplace, though the hearth remained unlit in the warmth of the day. On the small table before her, she had carefully placed 3 items: the lace handkerchief with its telltale bloodstain, the embroidery sampler with its hidden message, and the tin box containing Elizabeth Lethbridge's letters and diary. Colonel Lethbridge sat rigidly upright, his weathered face impassive but for the slight twitch in his left eyelid. Beside him, Mr. Carmichael looked pale but composed, the bandage on his temple a reminder of the recent attack. Mrs. Carmichael's dark eyes moved constantly between the Colonel and Miss Marple, watchful and wary. Mrs. Ellison, looking frailer than ever in the bright light, clutched her handbag in gnarled fingers. Inspector Slack stood by the window, notebook ready, his presence lending an official gravity to the proceedings. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but firm. "I believe the time has come to bring to light a truth that has remained hidden for far too long. The truth about what happened to Elizabeth Lethbridge in April of 1887. The Colonel stirred restlessly. "Miss Marple, I must protest. This obsession with ancient family history serves no purpose. Whatever may or may not have happened to my great-aunt is long past." "Not so past as all that," Miss Marple countered, "considering that someone was willing to commit burglary and assault just days ago to conceal it. No, Colonel, the past reaches into our present, especially when justice has been denied." She picked up the embroidery sampler, holding it so that all could see the delicate stitching. "Elizabeth left us this message, hidden in her needlework. Cellar wall, father knows. A desperate communication from a young woman who feared for her life." "Preposterous," the Colonel muttered, but his complexion had paled. Miss Marple continued, undeterred. "Thanks to this clue, Inspector Slack discovered a tin box hidden in another section of the cellar wall at Thornfield House. Inside were love letters between Elizabeth and her Italian music teacher, Giuseppe Varelli, as well as Elizabeth's own diary." Mrs. Carmichael leaned forward intently. Giuseppe's letters to Elizabeth? You found them? Yes, Mrs. Carmichael, Miss Marple confirmed. Or should I say, Miss Varelli, your interest in this matter goes beyond mere curiosity, doesn't it? Giuseppe Varelli was your great-grandfather. Yes, Mrs. Carmichael acknowledged, lifting her chin proudly. He never forgot Elizabeth, though he returned to Italy and eventually married another. The story of his lost English love was passed down through generations of our family. But there is more to the story than even you know, Miss Marple said gently. A thread that connects you not just to Giuseppe, but to Elizabeth herself. A confused frown crossed Mrs. Carmichael's face. What do you mean? Elizabeth died before they could marry. Elizabeth died, Miss Marple agreed, but not before certain events had taken place. You see, Elizabeth was with child when she died, Giuseppe's child. A collective gasp filled the room. Mr. Carmichael reached for his wife's hand, while the Colonel's face turned ashen. That's impossible, he protested. There was never any child. The family would have known. The family did know, Miss Marple corrected him. Or at least, your grandfather knew. He was the one who discovered Elizabeth's condition and her plan to elope with Giuseppe. According to her final diary entry, Elizabeth feared her father might try to prevent her departure by any means necessary. She turned to Mrs. Ellison, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. Mrs. Ellison, would you like to share what you know about Elizabeth's fate? The elderly woman straightened in her chair. My mother, she began, her voice quavering slightly, came to work at Thornfield as a scullery maid in 1886. She was barely 16. The following year, she left suddenly, supposedly to care for a sick relative. When she returned months later, she had me with her and a story about a hasty marriage to a soldier who died before they could formalize things. A story provided by the Lethbridge family, Miss Marple suggested, who gave her a cottage on their estate and later found positions for both of you at Thornfield. Mrs. Ellison nodded. Mother never spoke of my father, but on her deathbed, she told me that I was born of better blood than you'd think. She made me promise never to speak of it, for fear of what might happen to us both. Your mother, Miss Marple said softly, was present in the house the night Elizabeth Lethbridge allegedly fell ill. As a young scullery maid, she would have been nearly invisible to the family, easily overlooked, yet privy to the servants' gossip and observations. She saw something, Mrs. Ellison whispered, something that made the family send her away until after I was born. Miss Marple turned to the Colonel. Your grandfather, Colonel, discovered Elizabeth's pregnancy and her plan to elope with Giuseppe. There was a confrontation, a violent one, judging by the bloodstain on this handkerchief. In the struggle, Elizabeth was killed, whether intentionally or accidentally, we may never know. This is outrageous speculation, the Colonel burst out, but his protest lacked conviction. Is it? Miss Marple inquired mildly. The medical examination of the remains found in the cellar wall showed a fatal blow to the skull, and your father confessed the truth to you on his deathbed, didn't he? That's why you were so distressed when the handkerchief appeared at the church bazaar. The Colonel seemed to age before their eyes, the rigid military bearing giving way to the slumped posture of a man bowed by a burden carried too long. My father, he said finally, his voice barely audible, told me that his father, my grandfather, had confronted Elizabeth when he discovered